Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Sounds good.
So I want to welcome everyone back to the rest of our session. Our next session is about reimagining supply chain, which is a very, very important topic. Virtually every company that I know of is facing a lot of dislocation related to the whole supply chain problem. But I'm very, very pleased to have today's panel, Raj Gupta, who is formerly was the CEO of Rohm and Haas, is currently the chairman of Avantor, which is a chemicals life science company, and Aptiv, which is one of the largest automotive parts and systems companies in the world, and Prakash Chandrasekar, who is a partner in chemicals at the Boston Consulting Group, and specifically, he serves companies across the chemical value chain in their most critical issues related to strategy, supply chain design, operational performance improvement, and sustainability. And in the case of Raj, he's just had a long track record of very successfully managing companies. And so this is an issue that he's had to deal with on and off over time, but for which the companies that he's chair of are also dealing with the same issue. So we have really two very highly qualified panelists who can share their perspectives, but also from two different angles. What we've decided to do is we'll start with Raj. Raj is going to give some overview comments about his perspective on the challenge and so forth, and then we will have Prakash go through a number of points from his point of view in terms of advising clients and so forth. So Raj, let me turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Peter, for that nice introduction. And Prakash and I are pleased to share our perspective on one of what I call the hottest as well as topical challenge of supply chain and disruptions which everybody every day is seeing and experiencing with our customers, every company around the globe, including yours as well. And I saw some of the commentary that Ed shared with you in the previous session. I'll certainly do my best to look back and reflect on how what was a super efficient global supply chain across industries for a very long time suddenly became incredibly inefficient and high level of challenges that is posed for all of us. Prakash will actually offer some practical approaches based on his experiences to share what some of the short-term solutions for this are, but also look at how we should all be thinking about midterm, long-term to make the supply chain more resilient than what we saw with what happened with COVID in the last 2 years. So, if we go back and think about just-in-time and super efficient supply chains across all industries evolved over the last 2 decades, were primarily driven by globalization, commoditization, incredible transportation infrastructure, as well as drive for capital and cost efficiencies across all industries. And of course, information technology was a key enabler here as well. And all the companies across all industries took advantage of labor cost arbitrage and moved to asset-light model in pretty much all the industries by moving production, and not only production, but even what I call some of the labor force, skilled labor force, to outside their own home country. Obviously, this supply chain change really led to significant increase in complexity, single sourcing in certain cases, and exposure to geopolitical risk across the board. The COVID pandemic, a true blue swan event, resulting in steep decline in the demand in the second quarter of last year and dramatic resurgence starting in the fourth quarter of last year, exposed the underlying weakness of the supply chain to complexity, labor disruptions and shortages, overload of shipping infrastructure, air, sea, and land, unexpected natural disasters, where were there earthquakes in Japan, flooding in Texas, rain and wind storms, fires and heat waves around the world. And the result was substantial increase in cost and disruption in supply chains. And the interesting thing from my vantage point is, meanwhile, there were underlying long-term drivers which were going to lead to long-term supply chain disruption anyway. And those included, if you think about automotive industry, which is moving from gasoline and diesel engines to complete new technology of autonomous driving in electric vehicles, just to name one. And all the shift from in the energy industry away from fossil fuel to other alternative sources. Then the pressure of ESG and climate control and zero emission, which has huge impact across all the industries, not only in the manufacturing, but also transportation. And of course, the frequency and unpredictability of the natural disasters, as well as geopolitical risk of what we are discussing today with not only China, but across the globe. And all of a sudden, topic of supply chain has become everyday headline and grabbed the attention of CEOs. You heard Ed, I know all the companies I'm associated with, amount of time CEOs, CFOs, and the line management is spending on this matter, and of course the politicians and the government included, is quite extraordinary. So, I'm going to share a real life example of supply chain disruptions that has gotten attention of everyone, is the semiconductors. And of course, this shortage has impacted just about every end market you can think of, from automobiles, to mobile phones and laptops, to toys, to everyday home appliances, as well as the construction market, which is causing delays in the home constructions and increased cost as well. Let me take example of one of the companies I've served as board of directors for 12 years and last 7 years as chairman, which Peter mentioned, Aptiv. The start of that company was Delphi, and we split the company in two about 4 years ago into Aptiv, which is focused on electric vehicles, hybrids, as well as autonomous driving. And it's a classic example where semiconductor supply chain has impacted the company dramatically. And it's not only that, there are many other factors like material shortages of nylon polymers, transportation, as well as the labor costs and labor availability. For example, I mentioned in the second quarter of last year, auto demand essentially disappeared. It was down like 80-90% around the globe. And that led to cancellation of semiconductor orders by most auto companies and auto suppliers. Of course, what happened was, which is what has been a miracle when you think about it, is how all of us coped. The globe was really coped with COVID, and we still continue to survive and thrive. Virtual systems, the increased demand of mobile phones and mobile devices really took over. And of course, what happened was, when the demand came back for the automotive industry, there was practically no supply of semiconductors. And part of it is also the complexity of the semiconductor supply chain. For example, US uses 40+% of the semiconductor production in the world, but only produces 12%. And even in the supply chain, it's not only the Koreans and the Taiwanese that are major producers, but the amount of post-processing that gets done in Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the impact of pandemic has played out big time. And the cycle time in semiconductor production at the high end takes 6 months to produce from the wafer start to getting it to the customer because of the complexity of the manufacturing process. So Aptiv, give you an example of how Aptiv was impacted by this. So this year we thought would be a normal recovery. Things will get back to normal. And with the semiconductor and other material shortages, as well as availability of workforce, we are going to have 10% less revenue than what we projected. And we are talking about $1.5 billion less revenue this year than what we projected at the start of the year. Equally important, not only the lost profit on the revenue, we had $500 to $600 million increase in costs between labor shortages and ability to really sustain production when the customers wanted it, inflation, rise in the cost of freight cost, which I think Ed mentioned how many hundreds of millions of dollars, as well as the material cost. And I would say, the CEO there, Kevin Clark, and his team probably spend an hour every day more in talking to customers, talking to suppliers, managing the supply chain every single day. What has been interesting, though, I think our ability to navigate through this process short term has obviously been very painful and demanding and expensive. But the fact, and I think this goes back to the point that Ed made, and I'm going to actually talk about this topic at Société Chimie Industrielle next week, I think, Peter?
Yeah, on the 16th.
It's on the 16th, about leading transformation.
Yeah.
And Aptiv is a classic example of anticipating that transition to electric vehicles and high voltage. And we transformed our portfolio over the last 7 years. And we are growing at about 10 to 12 percentage points higher than the auto production, quarter after quarter, year after year. And the last quarter, we grew 18% above. And what it allowed us to do is that our stock price is at a new high. The valuation of the company is close to $50 billion from being bankrupt about 9 years, 10 years ago. So I think this goes back to how do you anticipate, how do you execute, and how do you pivot when the crisis hits? So I think that's a great, great example of what I have seen as to how the companies and the leadership have adjusted their plans long term to address these challenges. So I'm going to now pass it on to my fellow panelist, Prakash Chandrasekar from BCG. Prakash has been working with clients across industries and around the globe to adopt new tools and processes to address the short term, as well as how to address the midterm and long-term challenges, and reimagine the supply chain for the future to create resilience in the system. By the way, Prakash, I just found out yesterday, is also an alum of IIT Bombay in chemical engineering, so he knows more about this industry than I do. I graduated from the same institution back in 1967, but in mechanical engineering. So I'm now going back to being about chemicals and defer to you, Prakash, to talk about real practical steps that our attendees here and the companies can really use going forward.
Thank you, Raj. Prakash, can you start?
Yeah, happy to. Again, thanks, Raj, for the wonderful setup and framing the problem so well. And also to you, Peter, for the opportunity to speak at your conference. I would like to start by spending a few minutes building upon, Raj, the problems that you described, and reflecting on how we got here. And then we'll talk about, the actions that companies are taking to solve this challenge over the near term, midterm, and longer term horizon. So, in the past, and by past I mean say 5-10 years ago, when companies would optimize their supply chain design, or in some cases, take a clean sheet approach to restructuring their full supply chain, it typically went like this. One would start with the business strategy and basically ask the question, given your choices around where you want to play and how you're going to win, and the demand patterns within those chosen markets, the first question is, how many segments are needed from a supply chain perspective in order to fulfill your business strategy? And then second, within each of those segments, what are the target service levels that you would need, to execute on that? And that formed, the design basis, the design parameters around which, it essentially came down to an optimization problem between three variables. One was around fixed assets, where do you place your plans, what scale, and so forth. And then second, around working capital, and third, around operating cost, in order to meet, the target service levels. And as Raj mentioned in his opening remarks, with the globalization came increased competition and greater pressure for all of us to reduce cost. And as an industry, we responded. We responded pretty much by getting each function that touches that end-to-end supply chain to increase efficiency. So procurement made a big push to reduce cost, and frequently that meant global sourcing, or sourcing from lower cost countries. Manufacturing went about it by making a big push on capturing scale economies. So bigger assets, but fewer assets, more volume, greater OEE, which basically meant lower cost per ton. And then supply chain made a big push towards just-in-time models, which basically reduced working capital. And all of these different levers, when taken in isolation, are good, but when you add it up, what ended up happening is that the supply chain across the system, became brittle and less capable to absorb exogenous shocks into the that impacted the system, and it set off a chain of events that cut across industries. And frankly, it's been this way for several years. And as Raj mentioned, it took a combination of different factors like COVID, like the Texas freeze, the different storms, to really bring this issue to the forefront, and expose the fundamental weakness that's present in our supply chains. And we are seeing a number of companies starting to take action on this front. And I would like to start with some of the longer term design issues first. And what we are seeing, across the board, both in the chemical industry and other industrial sector more broadly, is that in addition to the three variables that I mentioned, which is fixed cost, working capital, operating cost, companies are now starting to take two additional variables into consideration. One is resilience, and then the second is carbon. And let me start on each, talk about each of these variables, and starting with resilience. So, in the past, resilience was largely ignored. And if it was considered, it was done so on a qualitative basis, which basically meant, the primary driver of supply chain design was cost and capital efficiency. And if you had two different options that were primarily, equal, then you would take the qualitative considerations into account. But what we are seeing now more and more is that companies are taking a highly analytical approach to intentionally design resilience into the system so that it can absorb these external shocks. So, how are they doing that? One approach that we have seen is starting to gain a lot of traction in the market is this concept of a digital twin, where you build, this virtual model of your end-to-end supply chain, essentially starting from every supply point, and in some cases, your supplier's supplier, that goes all the way to your manufacturing asset, to the different inventory buffers, to your different customer ship to points. And it takes into account, all the different transportation modes, be it rail, road, or barge, ocean vessel, what have you, the ports that are used. It's essentially a virtual depiction of your physical supply chain as it exists today. So why is this helpful? It's helpful because it allows you to simulate at a very granular level the economic impact of any number of plausible events. So if you want to think about, if there was a force majeure at one of your supplier locations, what would that do to your operation? Or if there was a Gulf storm in the Gulf Coast, or if there was congestion in one of the ports, what would the ripple effects be of that event? And when you think about it that way, ultimately risk, you can think of it as, the economic impact of an event multiplied by the probability of an event occurring. So, this analysis that I just described using the digital twin gives you the economic impact of any event. And you can think through different probability scenarios of, a storm, or a port congestion, or any number of different disruptive factors. And what this technique essentially gives you, it gives your team the ability to not only quantify risk, but it it allows you to frame a business case for risk reduction initiatives, which in the past was harder to do when you had an uneasy feeling, but you really couldn't put dollars next to that. And it also gives you the ability to put a counterbalance on cost and capital efficiency when you're optimizing the overall system. So that's the topic of resilience. Let me pivot a little bit to the second topic of carbon. So we have COP26 that is going on right now in Glasgow. And if you guys are following, the events last week, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, in her speech, urged countries to quote, put a price on carbon because nature cannot pay that price anymore. Very powerful words. Now let's assume for a minute that politicians and political leaders around the world listen to her and implement some form of carbon pricing. And the jury is out on whether it's a carbon tax or an emission trading scheme, whatever it may be. If there is a price on carbon, there are three scenarios that arise. Scenario one is there is a globally consistent price on carbon. Scenario two is there is a carbon price, but it varies across the world in different world region or by country. And scenario three is where there is a carbon price, it varies by region or country, but on top of that, there is a carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, or a carbon border tax as it's commonly known. And the spirit behind that is to create a level playing field for countries that have a higher price on carbon vis-a-vis imports from other countries that may have either a low price or no price for carbon at all. And I'm sure you have noticed that the European Union plans to implement CBAM between January 2023 to January 2026, so over that 3-year time frame. And a lot of the details are still being worked out. So what does the question, is what does these scenarios mean for your supply chain, for your asset footprint? You will need to provide traceability of product across your supply chain and be able to allocate the carbon emissions down to individual product lines if you're importing into these different markets. And then the other question is, does it create a market opportunity for you in some areas where competitors from other parts of the world may no longer be able to supply that region, or does it create a risk for you as well? So, this is a whole big issue that is coming at us very rapidly. And what we have noticed is not many people are talking about it. So I would urge really folks on this call and in this room to think through, what a carbon price or world with carbon price and CBAM could mean for your supply chain going forward, because it's going to be bumpy, even more bumpier structurally relative to what we have witnessed at least over the past 18 to 20 months. I would want to pivot a little bit to some of the near-term and midterm challenges as well. And in supply chain parlance, when we say midterm, we usually mean months. The unit of measure is months, so we're talking about a planning horizon. And when I say near term, it's more in days and weeks when you're talking about execution, fulfilling orders, and getting product out the door. And this is a pretty deep topic, but I will touch on three areas where we are seeing the most interest and activity across our client base. One is the topic of demand planning. The second is how do you respond effectively and efficiently to challenges as they arise? And third is how do you build the required capabilities within the organization? So let me touch on each one of these quickly. The first one is around demand planning. So this is an area where we have seen, advanced analytics, AI, and machine learning models really deliver, tremendous impact. And such models, learn over time. They get better. They reduce bias. They improve forecast accuracy. and most importantly, they free up salespeople and give them time back to spend more time with customers. So that is topic number one. And what we are also seeing on this demand planning is, in the past, when statistical forecasting models were used, it was mostly done with internal data. So based on your sales order transactions, how many products are going to what customers, what segments, which regions, what pack type, and so forth. But now we are seeing a greater push to combine your internal data with external data, such as, we're seeing companies use credit card transactions, web traffic, social media data, unstructured data from around the internet, consumer sentiment models, looking at government stimulus spending to generate demand in a number of end markets that we as an industry are suppliers into, and translating all of that into a demand forecast over multiple months that then constantly gets refreshed and improved over time. The second piece that I'd mentioned in terms of the near and midterm is about how you react, because we all live in a world where things don't always work according to plan. There are changes both on the demand side, there are logistical bottlenecks and other issues to work around. And here too, what we are seeing is taking a highly analytical approach to react to these challenges. And the digital twin concept that I had explained, when it comes to structural design of supply chains, is also extremely helpful to help companies, simulate what are the different possible interventions when some of these challenges occur, and take the most effective way forward in a highly fluid market environment. And then the third piece, I spoke quite a bit about data and analytics, and they are important, but ultimately it comes down to using the power of analytics to change the behavior of the people out on the front lines who are making these day-to-day operating decisions. And that really comes down, to the question of talent. And I'm sure you would have noticed, if you've been trying to build digital analytics capabilities within your organization, trying to find experienced data scientists who bring functional expertise in supply chain and who have some familiarity or exposure to the chemical industry, it's a daunting task in today's market. So, and given the importance of the skill set to your organization, as leaders, we really ought to be thinking about, how to access such talent. Should you build? Should you buy? Should you rent? And really the answer will vary from company to company. There was some We have seen a range of different models. If you have the scale to hire, fresh data science talent and train them in a couple of different functional areas in your business, that's great. That's ideal. But most companies don't have the scale to do that, and try to find ways to quote rent that talent from partners who have the scale to do that on behalf of a number of different organizations, might prove to be a more suitable option in a lot of these cases. And then third, I want to switch to the theme of a net zero supply chain, and this is a topic of tremendous importance. In the conversation with Ed Breen, I noticed, there were a few questions on this topic. It's critical to us as an industry and society as a whole. And I would like to split this up into two categories. One is around scope 1 and 2 emissions, and the second is around scope 3 emissions. So scope 1 and 2, as you all may be familiar, is emissions either in your manufacturing process or from energy that you consume as part of your manufacturing process. And I'm sure you all are all looking at building decarbonization plans, building site level abatement curves, looking at energy efficiency projects, buying renewable power, looking at CCUS or other technologies. So that action needs to be taken. It's necessary. And as you put a price on carbon, to my earlier point, a lot of these technologies will start to become economically viable as well. But when it comes to scope 3, which is all, your scope 3 upstream, which is emissions your suppliers have, and scope 3 downstream, which is all the logistics, shipping, and transportation emissions, plus end of life emissions. That is very complex. And as an industry, what we have found is companies don't quite know where to start on this yet. Everyone is just at the starting blocks, trying to figure this out. It is very complex with hundreds, if not thousands, of suppliers who are all at various stages in their own net zero journey. And it's a moving target because as your suppliers take action, your baseline changes and it needs to be constantly updated and refreshed. And, this is another area where we think digital and analytics can play a significant role, because we need to prepare for a world where carbon reporting becomes as important and rigorous as financial reporting, and that world is coming, especially when you're talking about border taxes and carbon product footprint, products carbon footprints. So, for all of this to gain traction, it's absolutely critical that carbon abatement and some of these, sustainability considerations are fully integrated into, the supplier selection and supplier management process. And for that to happen, a number of procurement organizations I have worked with in the past, are evaluated on year cost savings, and we think, that in and of itself is not, complete. We really got to look at it in terms of business value, and part of that business value comes from building resilience in your supply chain. Part of that business value comes from sustainability, and part of that comes from maintaining cost competitiveness. So all of these elements need to be looked at, in conjunction together, which is really the model where, as an organization, we need to move towards. So, I talk a lot here, but let me just summarize by saying that, in this whole supply chain area over the next few years, we're going to see tremendous change and tremendous dislocation, which is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for all of us to gain competitive advantage, to get ahead of it, as Ed Breen mentioned, and really, outdo your competitors. So, with that, let me pause here and give it back to you, Peter.
So, yeah, and we'll be talking about some of the ESG and, carbon neutral issues later on at another session. We're going to leave a little bit of time at the end for questions, but I want to pose a couple of, make one comment, but also pose a question to panelists. Obviously there's data part, but then there's also just how you operate your business, right? And in the near term, what has happened is a lot of companies have been stocking up on inventory and parts and so forth, which of course makes it even worse, because if people then do that, they really suck up the supply of materials. But that's one thing. And of course, obviously that affects your economics, because if you're carrying lots of raw materials inventory, then now your base of, what you need to get a return on goes up, right? The other, though, is that famous phrase, which now has become a curse word, which is just-in-time manufacturing. It used to be the thing that everyone, and now people are really rethinking that. And because for a lot of reasons, one is supply chain, but also geopolitical, right? To what extent can I depend on Vietnam or China and so forth if there's a long distance to ship, but also the cost? So I guess my first question to Raj is, to what extent do the companies that you are involved with, but also other companies that you know of, to what extent are they rethinking this just in time, but also where they're sourcing raw materials, right? Because one of the reactions is just to move lots of things to suppliers that are closer by or in your own country. So to what extent do you see that happening, revisiting this just in time, but also where you're getting your raw materials and energy?
Well, I think, Peter, the short answer is it's all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
the sense that, so much of the time and energy is today used on addressing short term, but give you examples of how people are thinking about midterm and longer term. So for example, number of large OEMs with resources have been talking about taking in-house the production of semiconductors. Because one of the interesting things about the semiconductors per se, in automotive industry, it's older technology. It is not the latest technology in semiconductors that's used in the car manufacturing. So one of the things they're doing is to get self-reliance even within their own shop. The second thing they're starting to work on, and this is going to take time, have more transparency of information between your customers, yourself, and your suppliers. Because as you know, what typically happens in these forecasts, customer wants to inflate the demand to be sure that they can get supply from their supplier. The suppliers take the same approach with their suppliers to make sure that they can get whatever they need whenever they need. And I think some of it goes back to what Prakash's point was. I believe, at least from what I've seen, the question is, it's not an obvious answer, is how do we improve the reliability of the forecast? And how do we move away from historical data reliance or our reliance on the sales force, which is very internally focused, to really saying a data-based forecast in collaboration with your supply chain partners? And if you combine those two, even if you increase the accuracy by 20, 30, 40%, it has dramatic impact in terms of the customer satisfaction, resilience of the supply chain, as well as cost. So, my long answer really is that, this is going to be an optimization and learning process. And it is not, obviously technology will have a role to play, but how we interact with our partners and how we think about the demand forecasting and in tandem address the issues, be willing to take some additional cost instead of relying on one single source, have multiple sources. Some sources that are nearby, recognizing that they will be high cost source, but all in the mix of overall design of supply chains to have this resilience and zero carbon. So I think everybody's thinking while they're fighting that short-term crisis, thinking about the midterm and long-term from multiple perspectives at this point in time.
Yeah. Another question before we open it up to questions to the audience is this. As the two of you have mentioned, the source of the current crisis is coming from many, many different factors. And it's everything from misforecasting demand and in semiconductors and therefore not gearing up to just for example, just the truck, people don't want to drive trucks anymore, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And some of these things are short-term or temporary. I'm confident at some point the semiconductor supply thing will get solved, although it takes time to build these facilities. But others have been going on for a long time. People have been dropping out as truck drivers for a really long time. And so it's not something that was either a short-term problem or one that will necessarily then correct itself. So I guess my question to both of you is, how do you, if you think about the 6, 7, 8 factors that cause the current supply chain problem, which are those that you think are temporary, and yes, they're a nuisance now, but they may go away? And which ones are longer term where if you're smart, you're going to have to find some way around it long term? And this question to both of you.
Sure.
Prakash, why don't you go first?
Yeah. So, let me start with the labor question first. So I was reading somewhere yesterday that during the first three months of COVID, we lost about 20 million jobs. Yeah, 20 million jobs in the first 2 to 3 months. Now that was right, during that initial dive. And over time, once the demand started to come back up, we can't hire 20 million people back in 3 months. It's just not designed to do that. So no, not in 3 months, not in 6 months. So part of that, is temporary. It's going to sort itself out over a period of time. And the labor shortage there will work itself out. But that also masks some of the structural issues that you mentioned, Peter. Say, like, for example, the driver challenge. And this is one, again, with autonomous things. We ought to be thinking about how to address that. And then, a broader question around, especially in the trades, is how do you build, a pipeline of talent? I live in Houston, so that's a question that keeps coming up in the Gulf Coast areas. How do you build, the trade talent? And should you adopt a model in Germany or other parts of Europe where you have a good apprenticeship program? And what's the role of the community colleges ought to play, and what should we as an industry and government, etc., do, to solve some of these, longer term issues. So that's a little bit on the labor side.
Yeah, but I'm actually trying to say, not because the labor supply is not just a supply chain problem.
Correct.
It's just how people their costs and so forth. I want to just focus right on the supply chain issue, right?
Sure.
And that's why I mentioned truck drivers, because truck drivers really is purely a supply chain issue. So if the two of you can tick off the 6 or 7 factors that you mentioned they're creating, and just simply say which ones are temporary and which are long term, right?
Sure.
Because I think the audience here needs to understand that. So either just run down the list and say which ones do you consider temporary and which ones do you consider really structural and long term.
Yeah. So on the structural long-term side, what we have found is historically, companies have not qualified many suppliers. So even if and this is probably a part of the drive for efficiency, and qualifying a supplier in a lot of cases is a long and arduous process, and you as a chemical company need to qualify yourself with your customers and so forth. So to me, this is a longer term structural problem that will work itself out over time, but it's not temporary. Another issue, when it comes to things like container balances around ports and so forth. So, I mean, this is one that, I would say is a bit more temporary in nature. And, once some of these demand supply balances get resolved, I think the container balance question will start to work itself out. The whole Suez Canal blockage, that was caught the media attention for a while. That worked itself out, but things related to that, when it comes to ocean freight on certain trade lanes and how volatile it is on certain lanes, that will go up and down. I think, with additional capacity, that is more in the order of months before we see some balance when it comes to pricing. I do think some of the challenges that I mentioned in terms of how the carbon tax would play out and the moves that companies start to make in anticipation of carbon pricing. That is a longer term issue that you ought to be keeping an eye on in terms of where your supply chain footprint is evolving over time.
Okay. Well, we have 1 minute. We have 1 minute left, so I'm going to allow, if someone has a question that they ask. Okay, go ahead, identify yourself and ask the question.
Hello, my name is Shayna Sanandi. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer for Encina. We're in circular chemicals, and I guess what I'm wondering is if what we're talking about here isn't really a larger structural problem in not having our whole enterprise set up for resilience. I mean, we're addressing one thing that's gone wrong. Well, I mean, many things have caused this one thing, the supply chain issue. But in the military college, the U.S. military college, there's this concept of VUCA, that we're living in times that are volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And that structurally, if you want to be successful, you have to be able to manage and lead in ways that address each of those factors. And I feel like this is just an example of getting ourselves into a situation where we are so dependent on things going just right for them to function and not having thought structurally of the bigger picture of how resilient are we.
Well, it's
And
that
this
problem
is
of the
just-
just-in-time is just-in-time doesn't leave you much
Resilience.
leeway, right, exactly.
Exactly. So what I'm saying is I think there's sort of a larger structural problem than just the supply chain
Okay.
issue. It's the way how we think about a business and how it responds to customer needs.
So that's a good comment, not a question really, but a comment and certainly a valid one. One last question, and then we're going to end this session. Carlos?
I have a question. Well, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. I'm curious, particularly with you, Prakash, since you're an international consultancy, all this argument about disruption of our supply chains are from the perspective of the users, not the suppliers. I wonder if you've had any experience with the actual suppliers that suffer, of course, some of the same effects because they can't sell what we can't buy because we can't produce. But how do they think about making more robust supply chains?
Sure.
Well,
So, let me take that. So, I think the chemical industry is unique in that we are customers and suppliers of each other. So, our fortunes kind of rise and fall together in a number of ways. So, I think it was like in paint and coatings, both PPG and Axalta and some of these companies talked about, how their sales went down because auto production went down because of the semiconductor crisis. So, we are all living through some of these challenges on both the buy side and the sell side. And what companies again are starting to do on the commercial angle is think through, how exactly are they serving? What percent of your revenue comes from, one sector, one customer? How best should you manage the commercial risk in terms of the portfolio of contracts? Are you tying it to raw materials? Are you exposing yourself to market movements? How much on contract versus spot? So I think the whole commercial strategy and how risk, which supply chain is one element of risk, plays into that is something that is being looked at by business leaders on the commercial side.
Well, thank you very much. And I got to tell you, this is such a huge problem that, there's so many dimensions. But I want to thank our two panelists, Raj and Prakash, for some very, very good insights on the issue. And this is very important. Maybe we should have some follow-on webcast or something on this issue because we're all really worrying about it. And the bottom line is we have an ecosystem that was very much built on, remember back in the 80s, just in time, the Japanese, and we all shifted to that. And there has to be some major rethinking about how we operate our businesses around this because the list is only partially temporary and a lot of the factors are long-term. So thank you very much. And thank you, Prakash. And I think, Raj, you have to, go back to a board meeting.
Great. Thank you, Peter.